Okay, we're over here in Maya now. I've got this clean scene and I've got the script editor open here. And the first thing we need to do in Maya is to open up the command port to our local host with the same port number as we're sending to from our processing sketch. So the mel command to do that is command port minus name, and 127.0.0.1 is localhost, and that's what we identified in the processing client, and the port is 604. I'm also going to make a button out of these, and I'm also going to make a button that closes the command port. Sometimes it's difficult to do editing in Maya when a processing sketch is actually sending data, so it's useful to be able to close the command port as well. So now that I've written both of those out in my script editor, I'll highlight them both and drag them to the custom shelf, and I'll name them open, and I'll name it the second one close. Okay, and I've already done that here, and you need to look in your documentation on how to name your buttons of your mel scripts. If you don't have them named, they're not much use to anybody. Okay, now that we've got our command port buttons set up, let's go ahead and we'll build the info node that is going to collect the data. So it's a good idea to put this on a locator, and I'm going to name the locator info. And we identified two values that we're going to send from our processing sketch into Maya, so we're going to add them with modify add attribute, and we're going to add ourselves an F1 variable that's a float. So add F1, and then we'll add an F2, and we'll say OK and close that. So now we have F1 and F2 over here. I'm just going to take this time to do a real quick bit of tidy up in channel control on this info node, and I'm going to clean everything but visibility out of the channel box, and that minimizes what we've got. I usually leave visibility in there in case I want to hide or unhide something and have that that attribute exposed. Okay, I think we're ready to test our sketch here. I'll just save this off, and I will open the command port. Opening the command port doesn't give me any feedback in the command line, but if I try to open it again, I'll see that it's already active, and that's a good little bit of feedback. So I'm going to go over here to my processing sketch, and I'm going to start the sketch up. So it compiles and it opens me a default processing window here, and it's important for this to work that when key pressed is hit, that we have this window in the front and focus on this window. So I'm going to focus on this window and press the 1 key, and we can see in real time here now the attribute F1 on the info node changing as I press the keys, and as I press the 2 key we can see the F2 moving, and if I press both, they both move. So also note I have the frame rate up here, and we're getting 25 frames a second in Maya even though the timeline's not running, and that's because Maya's forced to accept these mel commands that are streaming in from the processing sketch set at 25 frames a second. Okay, this is all working, so let's go and connect something up here. In order to do some editing in Maya, I'm going to shut down this data that's streaming in here at 25 frames a second. So I'm going to stop the processing sketch, and I'm going to close the command port, and now I have good control over Maya here. I'm going to create a polygon sphere, and it's going to be called sphere 1, and I'll just move it over to here and over to here, and I'll delete the history on it, and I'll duplicate it, and now we have sphere 1 and sphere 2. There's many ways that we could hook the data from the info node up to these two spheres to see some interaction happening. One of the most flexible is the set-driven key. So I'm going to go ahead and use that method to connect these attributes together. So I'm going to go to my animate, set-driven key, and set. And I'm going to load in the driver, which is info, and set the driving node, which is F1. And I'm going to load in driven, polysphere 1, and I'll set the translate Y. You might remember set driven key, we set driver, we set driven, and we key. So we've got driver set to 0, F1 is at 0, the sphere is on the ground plane in translate Y, so I'm going to key this relationship, and now I'm going to set the driver node to 1. This is what's going to happen when the keyboard 1 is pressed, and the driven, I'm going to move that up to near the top of the screen here, and I'm going to key that relationship. So quickly testing this, setting F1 to 0, the sphere goes down, setting F1 to 1, the sphere goes up. Okay, that's working well. Okay, let's set up the other sphere, and we'll make a connection through the set-driven key from the F2. So I've got info loaded as driver. The driver attribute is now going to be F2. I'll load sphere 2 as driven, and I'll set translate Y as the driven attribute. So modify driver, modify driven, and key. So let's check driver is at 0. Sphere 2 is on the ground plane. That's going to be the relationship at F2 equals 0. So I'll key that. And now I'll modify driver, which is F2 to the value of 1. That's when the 2 key is held down. And I'll set the driven, which is the polysphere 2Y, and this one I won't move quite so high. And this kind of demonstrates the flexibility of this approach to driving attributes in Maya from the info node using the set-driven key node. And I'll key that relationship. And before I close this up, I'll just select F2 and set to 0 and make sure that's working. 1, set this to 1. Yep, that's all working great. Okay, I think we're ready to close this up here, and we'll test our sketch running again. It's important to know that we do need to open the command port before we run the processing sketch, or else we're going to error out. So open the command port, check again. Yes, it's already active. That's a good sign. Come over here with our processing sketch. We'll start up the processing sketch, and I'll just move that aside, and I'll give focus to the video window, and now we see in real time when I press the keys, I'm getting data streaming into Maya at a very high rate, and I'm able to now manipulate objects in Maya with external real-time data. Join us on the next video when I will look at getting data into processing from an external source. I'm going to use the TouchOSC on an Android phone to drive values in the processing sketch.